Prior to 2002, developer WayForward hadn't created a game that granted them any sort of meaningful legacy as a company, despite having been operating for 12 years by that point in time. The bulk of their output consisted of either games that utilised characters licensed from pre-existing properties, ranging from Mickey Mouse to Sabrina the Teenage Witch, educational PC software, or a combination of both. Even with Extreme Sports, a Game Boy Color title that didn't take comfort on the shoulders of already well-established franchises receiving praise from contemporaneous critics, it failed to leave any sort of lasting impact by itself. Although it was on the back of Extreme Sports that this video's topic du jour was to be forged. It wasn't until Shantae, also on Game Boy Color, that WayForward were finally able to release a game that was befitting of the talented staff whom the company was comprised of, even if it took a few years for the fruits of their labour to truly materialise. In this retrospective series, I will be looking at each of the Shantae games in the order of their release. In addition to examining each one individually, I'll also explore how the series has evolved over time, in relation to not only each other internally within the franchise, but also to the ever-changing wider video game landscape. As a quick aside, the footage you are seeing was all captured from an emulator, running the game as if it was being played on a Game Boy Color rather than a Game Boy Advance, a point upon which I shall elaborate later on. Now obviously it's impossible to explore the evolution of Shantae at the genesis of the franchise, so I will instead provide a brief history of the series' debut title, which was first released on June 2nd, 2002. The Shantae concept can be traced back to 1997, with WayForward looking to develop the game for personal computers, or potentially the PlayStation. It was to be a platforming adventure with characters being brought to life through the use of traditional animation techniques, in conjunction with 3D rendered backgrounds for the game's locales, with animated sequences to present and further the narrative occurring periodically throughout. Although the intended presentation of the world of Shantae had to be drastically reformed in order to work within the confines of Nintendo's handheld, a lot of the planned gameplay mechanics and ideas were preserved, and found their way into the finished product. From the very beginning, it was decided that Shantae's primary offensive weapon was to be her long hair, used in a whip-like fashion. Although this wasn't to be the sole tool in her arsenal, she would also be able to perform magical dances that would conjure various elemental attacks, and even with this ability being cut, the dancing concept remained, and became a central mechanic of the game, albeit not as a means of combat. Also making its way through development is the looping world map, whereby if you were to perpetually travel in a single direction, you would eventually find yourself back at the point where you began, a feature that's commonplace in the RPG genre. Another notable component that also remained unchanged was the usage of animals as an aid that Shantae could utilise in her quest. Originally intended to be summonable allies that would perform actions Shantae herself is incapable of, such as the elephant being able to trample over usually impassable obstructions, or the tiger that would allow you to leap over great chasms. At some stage in development, this concept was changed into having Shantae herself transform into the animal. I suspect this may have been a concession necessitated by the project shift from PC or home console to Game Boy Color title. Having an animal familiar, in addition to having Shantae and potentially multiple foes on screen at once, might have been too taxing on the Game Boy's hardware, not to mention the console's highly limited screen real estate. It should be noted that the harpy transformation was always an intended feature alongside the ability to call upon various animal species, so the developers may have instead elected to simply consolidate Shantae's skill set. As for why Shantae moved away from the computer and home console space to the portable realm, Matt Bozon, the game's director and co-creator, explained in an interview with IGN back in 2000. Typically, there's fewer cooks. A small team can focus on making a good game and be relatively left alone. It allows for more creative freedom and flexibility of design, which ultimately leads to a better game. He would also explain in this interview that the engine Shantae was using came from a modified version of that found in Extreme Sports, which may also account for why the project was greenlit for the Game Boy, as they already had some of the necessary tools in place from the get-go. Bozon also revealed that the central reason why they struggled to find a publisher for the game wasn't primarily due to Shantae being an unknown and unproven franchise at the time, but rather the cost of manufacturing the 32 megabit battery backup cartridges that the game required. It was eventually Capcom who took the plunge on the project and signed on to be the game's publisher, and despite development being 95% complete by the time they invested in it, Capcom held back on releasing the game for 8 months. During this time, the Game Boy Advance had firmly entrenched itself in the market as the must-have handheld system for the new millennium, and Shantae was immediately doomed to obscurity by virtue of being released on a console almost a year to the day after its successor was available to the general public in America, which was the game's sole region of release. When looking back at Shantae, the two facets of it that I find to be most noteworthy is its exceptionally high quality presentation, as well as the form in which the game takes. Shantae boasts some of the most impressive graphics seen on the system, with a mixture of detailed, colourful sprites and some exceptional art direction that brings Sequinland to life. Each location has a distinct colour scheme in order to make them more identifiable and memorable, from the golden sands of the desert areas to the perpetually grey skies of Rainstorm River. You always know where you're situated in the world. This also serves to aid the player in navigation, as once you become familiar with the landscapes, you know where each location is relative to everywhere else. Therefore, with each area being so graphically pronounced, you're less likely to lose your bearings on your journey, where the goal is to prevent the devilish pirate Risky Boots from creating a doomsday device out of a steam engine that she pilfers. Some technical trickery has also been employed in order to simulate features that weren't truly available on the GBC. Through techniques such as animating the background, the game is able to approximate parallax scrolling to create richer, more immersive environments to explore. This same sort of creative design is similar to what developer Tamtex did with 1991's Metal Storm, another cult classic that didn't fare well in its own time. Shantae herself is one of the console's crowning achievements. Her sprite is exquisitely animated, from her ponytail whipping attack to her Rakshaki-inspired dance move. It is evident that a great deal of passion was put into bringing her to life and making her stand out as a character compared to her peers on the relatively underpowered console. It's not just her standard sprite that impresses. When you enter a town, the game shifts to an over-the-shoulder perspective, wherein you can rotate Shantae towards the direction you wish to go, and upon selection of your destination, Shantae will run off into the background. As you rotate, you'll also pass by various NPCs, whom when interacted with will provide some helpful tidbits of information. As you continue to rotate, the characters will walk away rather than stay rooted in place, giving each settlement a more kinetic, actively lived-in feel, a touch which further assists in making Sequinland come across as a fully realised creation that manages to seem grander and more expansive than it truly is. The level of quality also extends to the audio presentation, where composer Jake Kaufman did a terrific job. In some of the tracks that feature early on in the game, he manages to simulate traditional Arabic percussion instruments that aid in establishing the world, like with each of the locations having a unique look to them in order to provide them with their own identity. Each town also has an exclusive piece of music that will accompany you during your stay there. Bandit Towns, for instance, creates a sense of uneasiness to convey that this place is where Sequinland's more crooked residents live. But it still borrows from Arabic melodies to remain thematically consistent with the rest of the game, whereas Zombie Caravan's tune borrows from 90s house music, creating an up-tempo piece which assures you that despite being surrounded by the undead, you're not in any sort of danger here. As for the game's form that I mentioned, while it may seem at first glance that Shantae is a traditional standard 2D platformer, a genre so prevalent on the system, the game more closely skews to being a Metroidvania. While it may only partially stand under the Metroidvania umbrella, it does bear a number of hallmarks found within the subgenre. While it does eschew the labyrinthine style map, instead opting for a linear looping ring style of overworld, its map design is one that encourages players to explore and re-explore throughout the game. High walls require you to become a monkey so that they can be scaled, or large gaps in the earth that can't be crossed until you've discovered the spider and its ability to cling to specific surfaces. These transformations are Shantae's interpretations of character progression based on their utility, performing the same role as Samus's suit upgrades or the relics that Alucard can make use of. As you sift through each location, you'll uncover hidden treasure that serves to boost Shantae's capabilities. There are permanent health upgrades, a la The Legend of Zelda, and secret talismans that enhance your transformations by granting them the ability to fight. An in-game economy is also present, with currency being acquired through defeating monsters or partaking in the various minigames accessed within each town. With the gems you gather, you can purchase various items such as restorative potions or more combat-oriented wares that will assist you in battle. You can also buy permanent combat upgrades, enabling Shantae the use of more than just her hair as a weapon. The central way in which Shantae differs from a true Metroidvania is in the game's usage of dungeons, rather than having the entirety of the action take place in the overworld. There are 4 dungeons scattered about the land, with tougher enemies, puzzles to solve, transformational dances to find, and bosses to overcome. This is where the meat of the game occurs. In this regard, Shantae more closely resembles NES-era proto-Metroidvanias like Hudson's Far Xanadu or Falcom's Legacy of the Wizard. So while it may lack the intricate, interconnected world design, or certain RPG-centric mechanics found in other Metroidvanias, Shantae takes advantage of enough of the genre's characteristics to elevate itself to a one-of-a-kind game amongst the Game Boy Color library. Gameplay can be broadly split into two categories: overworld traversal and dungeon expeditions. Each area that forms the overworld aren't just differentiable by their art direction, but also by the array of challenges they present to the player. The waterfall provides a much more vertical experience than other regions, where you're tasked with having to scale the falls in order to advance, whereas the zombie swamp tasks players with making precise jumps between many small platforms. The varied level design is yet another way in which the world of Shantae is made more memorable to the player, as once you retread your steps at various points, you're able to make associations with how each area looks and what skills will be required of you in order to forge ahead. It is in these more platform-abundant areas where Shantae's controls are most appreciable. You're able to commence the jump while either stationary or moving, and that includes while either walking or at full sprint. Once Shantae has left her feet, you maintain full control over her trajectory and can accurately steer yourself to wherever your intended landing point is. Each of the transformations also have their own distinct control. The monkey being so much lighter has a more floaty feel while in the air, meanwhile the sluggish elephant is barely able to leave the ground at all. However, the controls are somewhat hindered by Shantae's ambitious design. Despite having the graphical flair of some of the best titles on NES and even some Super Nintendo games, what it can't match was the resolution that those consoles output. All the large sprites in the game end up hogging a large portion of the Game Boy's very limited display area, meaning the action takes place at a scale where you can't see a great distance around you, particularly where verticality is concerned. When standing on a ledge, you're often forced to make a blind leap of faith, as you have no vision of what's below you. This problem does lessen as you become more accustomed to Sequin Land's topography, but being able to shift the camera's perspective up and down slightly would have gone a long way to mitigating this issue. I should note that this isn't anywhere nearly as egregious here as in many other Game Boy platformers. Enemy placement provides you with enough time to react, and the vast majority of platforms are positioned in a way that the challenge comes from your precision, rather than them being so far away that they're all but completely out of view. A trick developers were known to pull as a simple but cheap means of inflating a game's difficulty. As you roam the lands, you'll also notice the game has a day-night cycle, which while a nice feature as far as immersion is concerned, offers very little meaningful impact. Certain minigames can only be played depending on the time of day, and monsters in the overworld grow stronger at night, along with that being the only time when the 12 collectible fireflies are obtainable. But beyond that, it's rarely something that the player has to take into consideration. The majority of the time spent in the overworld will be with the goal of reaching the next town or dungeon in your campaign, and in this regard, Shantae strikes a nice balance between telling the player where they need to go, whilst also not fully holding your hand. The game ensures that you're never at a loss as to where you need to go next, but often deliberately omits key information as to how you need to get there, requiring some exploration on the player's part. This is where the looping map design has the most significant impact. Although you may be provided with the information that your next objective is in a specific direction, reaching your destination may require you to depart in the opposite way and loop around, as you'll be gated off from taking the more direct route due to not yet having the required animal ability. Whilst this is a clever trick the first time it's employed, map tracking through previously explored areas multiple times gets tedious, especially if there's nothing new for you to do there. I think the intention was for the player to reinspect each section of the map whilst backtracking, having likely gained a new transformation, using them to reach previously inaccessible areas. The problem with this comes from the fact that navigating the overworld actually provides a greater challenge than the dungeons at times. A lot of these areas consist of very large screens, with enemies located frequently throughout, leading some screens of the game acting as something of an endurance test, where simply surviving takes precedent over combing the land for new secrets. This issue is only alleviated by Shantae's Harpy form, which is easily the most powerful of the 4 transformations, as it allows you to fly above all the obstacles that usually inhibit you when you're bound by gravity. Due to this, I, like many people who've played the game, reserve the majority of my treasure hunting escapades until acquiring the Harpy at the back end of the story, owing to it being much easier to maneuver through the different locations when constantly having to deal with enemies wasn't a concern. It is within the depths of the dungeons where Shantae's gameplay really shines. The same design philosophy that created the overworld locations has also been the driving force behind the dungeons' composition. The format of them is clearly patterned on The Legend of Zelda. For instance, each dungeon has its own unique gimmick, such as the magnetic creatures in the Golem mine that are either attracted or repelled by Shantae based on whether she is charged with the red or blue polarity, or in the Twinkle Palace where you must leap into a vortex that sends Shantae hurtling at great speed in the direction of the player's choosing. Each of these gimmicks will be introduced in a safe area, where the player can learn how the system works without the risk of dying. This will then be followed up by adding additional challenges, tasking you with applying what you've learned, presenting a reasonable learning curve where you're never ill-prepared. There will also be some light puzzle solving, and while a reasonable criticism of the game is that all of these are overly simplistic, I find that they provide a nice momentary respite from the action. Of course, finding a new transformation is essential, as the powers they provide will be mandatory to reach the end of the dungeon and accompanying boss fight. These bosses will necessitate the use of your newly acquired transformation in order to defeat, but as usage of the transformation is required in order to access the boss in the first place, you should have an understanding of how they function, continuing the trend of letting players learn in safe environments in order to make the challenges more honest later on. It is amid these boss fights though, where the game's dancing and transformation shows its biggest drawback, which is that it takes too long and leaves Shantae vulnerable to attack. Transforming is done by entering dance mode, and then inputting a series of button presses at the right time. It doesn't actually take all that long, but in the heat of battle, you're very likely to take an unavoidable hit, and it's also the time where you're most likely to flounder the timing of your inputs due to the action occurring in tandem with your attempts at metamorphosis. Upon victory over the boss, you will acquire an elemental stone. These don't have any actual in-game usage, but are instead plot-related items that Risky Boots is attempting to amass in order to augment the stolen steam engine. The last point of note on the dungeons are the warp squid babies, with each dungeon containing 5 of these infants to find. Gathering and returning 4 of them to any town will allow Shantae to teleport back to that location at any time. This warp system is definitely what I found to be the weakest aspect of the game. Tying the crucial ability to teleport between towns to an optional hidden collectible only works against the player, and is conspicuous in its contrast to the player-positive ideology employed everywhere else. While the squids aren't too problematic to locate, it's easy to miss out on 1 or 2, or in some cases you'll be unable to find them at all on your first visit to a dungeon, as they'll require a transformation you won't have yet acquired. While the game's story isn't worth discussing beyond the plot synopsis, what does warrant mention though is Shantae as a character. Clad in a traditional badla, Shantae doesn't sport the kind of look one would expect to see in a lead video game character, particularly from this time period. Her attire makes total thematic sense considering she's a half-genie, which is obviously taken from the idea of a djinn out of Arabian mythology. She displays a very peppy and confident personality, and comes across as a very capable individual, despite the limitations the game infers that she suffers from due to only being a half-genie. Despite being a character of Western origin, Shantae herself being designed by Erin Boson, who also provided some animation work for the game, she's clearly moulded on Japanese anime heroines. Matt Boson revealed that inspirations for the character include Nadia, Secret of Blue Water, Rumiko Takahashi's Ranma 1/2, and many of Hayao Miyazaki's works. Although there had been numerous female leads from Western studios by the point that Shantae was released, the most notable of which, Lara Croft, having already left her mark on video game and pop culture history by this time, they were still few and far between. It's quite likely that WayForward would have had an easier time finding a publisher if they presented the same game, but with a male protagonist. They commendably didn't waver though, which resulted in a more unique and memorable character. While Shantae doesn't contain much dialogue in order to present and develop its heroine, a great deal of our leading lady's spirit is conveyed through animation. The game doesn't explicitly tell us much about Shantae, but so much about her can be inferred by the way she's animated. The confidence of her dancing, her self-assured walk, in addition to her drive to do what's right, and stop at nothing to thwart Risky Boots. While the supporting cast don't have a great deal of personality, even Risky herself doesn't amount to much more than a typical cartoon antagonist, everyone has unique designs that allows them to stand out from each other. It provides a measure of individuality that allows the cast to become more memorable than standard NPC fare, despite their existence only really being to signpost where Shantae needs to go next. Regardless of the all-round excellence of Shantae as a complete package, it was always destined to be a cult hit. Matt Boson has stated that from what he heard, the game sold out of its initial print run, which was only around 20 to 25,000 copies. Shantae isn't a case of a game that wasn't appreciated in its own time, with reverence for it only being found in later years. It has always been a critical and artistic success, just with the caveat that not a great deal of people were able to experience what it had to offer at its launch. Obviously it didn't help Shantae's cause that the Game Boy Advance was released a year before it, but I believe that this issue was somewhat compounded by one of the release games for the GBA being Konami's Castlevania Circle of the Moon, which at the time was one of the most impressive handheld games ever seen. It was a massive non-linear action platformer that directly followed in the footsteps of Symphony of the Night, with the outstanding audio and visuals that were emblematic of the series. It had the side effect of significantly dating Shantae's ambitious ideas by making the entire game seem minuscule by comparison. While it obviously doesn't diminish any of WayForward's artistic achievements, it's clear to see why Shantae wouldn't have appealed to the average consumer at the time. The only real advantage to the delayed release was that it granted the time for some advanced enhancements to be implemented. Shantae is one of a handful of GBC games that had additional features unlocked when played in a Game Boy Advance console. This shouldn't come as a surprise, as WayForward had already enacted this in Wendy, Every Which Way, released the prior year, a game that coincidentally was also inspired by Metal Storm. Should a Shantae cartridge be used on a GBA console, the game's colour palette will be enhanced to try and make up for the GBA's infamously poorly lit screen. The reason I played through the game without this feature is that the colours seem blown up when presented on a modern display. You will also have access to one additional dance that allows Shantae to transform into a Tinkerbat, one of Risky's underlings. This is something of a jack-of-all-trades form, as it combines the abilities of the monkey, elephant and spider, somewhat upsetting the balance of the game for the reasonable price of 500 gems. I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that WayForward had high hopes that they could turn Shantae into a franchise right from the beginning. After the defeat of Risky Boots at the end of the game, she can clearly be seen making an escape, setting the player up for further adventure in the future, although it wouldn't be for quite a while that a follow-up to Shantae's debut outing would be released. Even to this day, the original game has remained somewhat elusive in terms of official acquisition methods, despite interest having considerably risen over time. Original copies have since become the highest priced Game Boy Color game on the second-hand market, and it wasn't until 2013 that the game would get a re-release on the 3DS eShop. Although it isn't available at the time of this writing, Shantae is finally getting a worldwide release in the form of a digital download on Nintendo Switch, and WayForward have partnered with Limited Run Games for a print run of reproduction Game Boy Color cartridges. This proves the indelible legacy that Shantae has slowly but surely crafted for itself, becoming WayForward's signature franchise in the process. On the next episode of this series, we leap forward 8 years for Shantae's return. I hope you'll join me again, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video.